Eddard Stark stood on the pier at Dragonstone, the salt wind whipping through his hair, already flecked with the first traces of gray that had come far too soon. Though the sun was drifting low, its golden light broken by the jagged silhouette of the fortress behind him, the day felt strangely new, as though it were the beginning of a story no bard had ever told. He had left Winterfell under the heavy weight of duty, summoned south by the old friend he had once followed into battle with unwavering loyalty. The summons had come by Raven with King Robert Baratheon's seal, commanding his presence not in King's Landing but across the sea. So here he was, never once having imagined this path in his younger days, resigned to the fact that life in the Seven Kingdoms shifted as unpredictably as the wind on the narrow sea. The bark of a deckhand's voice echoed along the docks, calling men to raise the sails on the ship that would carry them east. Robert had told Ned plainly, "We have word that Daenerys Targaryen lives in Pentos. There's talk that she's gathering allies, perhaps preparing to reclaim her father's throne. If that's so, then I have to see her face to face. I want you beside me." The request had shattered every assumption Ned had held since the rebellion, igniting old mistrust in his belly, mistrust for the Targaryen name, for the dragons that once haunted the skies. But he could not refuse his friend, his king. Perhaps it was the memory of that young man, Robert, riding victoriously in the rebellion, or perhaps it was the sense that this decision, however mad it sounded, was beyond anything Ned had the power to deny. So he had come, his duty binding him as tightly as any vow he had ever sworn. Robert stood further along the pier, conversing with a cluster of guards and lords whose faces Ned recognized from King's Landing. The king's once muscular frame had gone a little thick from years of feasting, and the crown weighed heavier on him than any war hammer had. But there was no mistaking the brash, larger-than-life figure that Ned had once followed into countless battles. Now Robert's voice was subdued, solemn. The glow that lit his eyes in younger days was dimmed by worry. Talk of the Targaryens had reawakened ghosts within him, ghosts tied to Lyanna's memory and the heartbreak that never left him. Ned had hoped, deep in his heart, never to confront that name again, Targaryen, lest it conjure an avalanche of grief and fury for both men. But the realm's politics had shifted. Jon Arryn was dead, and Stannis had discovered something or other, dark rumors, secrets. And now it seemed the best recourse was for Robert to meet Daenerys Targaryen before she could become a threat. Or so he believed. Ned wasn't certain that forging an alliance with a Targaryen was wise, but he would stand by Robert as he always had. With a troubled sigh, Ned stepped aboard the ship, feeling the timbers shift and sway beneath his boots. Men filed in behind him, carrying crates of supplies, casks of wine, the personal effects of the king's retinue. Robert came last, pausing just at the gangplank to stare across the water. A hush fell over the men as the king said in a tone nearly lost to the breeze, "You're doing the right thing, Ned. I promise you that. This has to be done." Ned bowed his head slightly in acknowledgement, though not with utter conviction. The sails were unfurled, snapping in the wind, and the ship lurched away from Dragonstone, forging eastward across the narrow sea. Days passed in a haze of gray weather and the ocean's relentless drone. Ned kept to himself mostly, his mind drifting to Winterfell, Catelyn's face, the voices of his children in the courtyard. He wondered if Sansa was upset about his absence, or if Arya would run amok with needlework forgotten. And Bran, always climbing. Robb, on the verge of manhood, probably training diligently. Ned felt a pang as he realized he might miss part of his children's growth, small moments of peace that were fleeting and precious. But duty called. He prayed the old gods would watch over them. Robert spent most of his days above decks, though not carousing as he once did. Instead, he studied sea charts with the ship's captain or conferred with his few trusted lords. The only time Ned saw flashes of the Robert of old was when they shared wine late at night. The king would bellow with laughter at a jest told by Ser Barristan and Selmy or one of the other knights who accompanied them. Yet even those laughs sounded forced, lacking the hearty vigor that had once been Robert's trademark. Late into the nights, their conversations circled back to the same point, Daenerys Targaryen. "I've heard she's a girl of, 16? 17? Robert would muse, wiping foam from his beard after a swig of ale. "She'll be frightened out of her wits if we march up to her door. But if I can talk to her, see her face, perhaps there's a chance we can avoid bloodshed." He never mentioned her father, the Mad King, or the atrocities that had occurred during the rebellion. Perhaps those memories were too raw or simply too complicated for words. Ned would only nod and keep his misgivings to himself. He remembered all too clearly what Targaryens were capable of, and he doubted a single conversation could erase all the havoc wrought between their houses. At dawn on the 12th day at sea, a faint outline of land appeared across the horizon, gilded in the rosy light of sunrise. "Pentos," Ned observed that Robert stood at the prow, silent and grim, while the rest of the company began to stir and gather their belongings in anticipation. A trickle of excitement went through the men, excitement for new shores, exotic foods, the city's storied wealth. For Ned, it felt more like stepping into a dream. So much of his life had revolved around the 7 kingdoms that crossing to the free cities felt both foreign and inevitable. He lingered at the rail, letting the morning wind cool the tension in his mind. The sea had been uneasy for days, and so had he. When they finally docked, a small welcoming party awaited them, dressed in bright silks so unlike Westerosi fashions. The harbor of Pentos was bustling, fisher boats hawking their catches, merchant vessels weighed with spices, crates, wines, a flurry of different tongues echoing across the docks. Ned spotted a representative from Illyrio Mopatus, a name he had heard in rumors, a magister of Pentos known to have a hand in many intrigues. This man, a portly figure wearing rings that flashed in the sunlight, approached Robert with extravagant courtesy. Although Robert was not wearing his crown, he had chosen a simpler gold circlet for traveling. There was no mistaking his regal bearing and the crowd of knights behind him. The magister's messenger bowed deeply, greeting Robert as Your Grace and urging him to follow to the lavish manse where Daenerys Targaryen was said to be staying. Ned eyed the city's architecture and the swirl of colors. Pentos was a place of domed roofs, walled gardens, and canals. Towering walls of old brick gave the city a labyrinthine feel, so different from the structured, imposing presence of King's Landing or the quiet solidity of Winterfell's gray stone. As they made their way through the streets with guards flanking the retinue, curious onlookers peered from windows or doorways. Some recognized the Baratheon stag on the banners, others simply saw powerful foreigners. Ned couldn't help but be on alert. He had always been uneasy in unfamiliar territory, especially under uncertain intentions. They arrived at the Magister's estate by midday. The gates opened onto a courtyard filled with lemon trees and shimmering fountains. Exotic birds roamed among the hedges, their calls echoing softly. A sense of wealth pressed in from all sides, from the mosaic floor to the colonnades draped in bright cloth. Yet Ned felt a chill run down his back. He had heard the rumors of Targaryen marriages and the savage Dothraki Khal she had wed. Though Daenerys was said to be widowed now, stories painted the girl as a fledgling queen waiting to reclaim the Iron Throne. And here they were, coming to see her, perhaps to invite her back. Robert's plan was not entirely clear. If anyone had told him he'd be forging alliances with Targaryens, he would have called them mad. But the times were changing. They were led inside. The place was nearly silent, as though it had been carefully staged to receive guests of great importance. A few unsullied stood guard, their faces as impassive as statues behind their tall spears. Ned's every nerve was strung taut. Somewhere in these halls, Daenerys Targaryen waited. That name alone was enough to summon images of flames and madness, half-remembered tragedies from the rebellion. Yet what if, contrary to all they believed, she was the key to warding off some greater threat? Ned still feared White Walkers in the far north, or the storms of political unrest in the capital. If forging peace with the last Targaryen line could prevent war, was it not worth at least exploring? Robert's broad shoulders seemed tense as they walked, though he tried to maintain a kingly visage. Eventually, they were shown into a vast chamber lined with silken hangings. There, perched on a cushioned divan, was the silver-haired girl in question. She stood at their entrance, her slender form wrapped in pale blue. Ned could see the Targaryen heritage in her eyes, a faint violet hue, and in the almost ethereal hue of her hair. It triggered an unsettling memory of Rhaegar, though her delicate features were different. At her side was a stern-faced man in a cloak of patterned cloth, clearly a guard or advisor, and behind her stood a handful of loyal followers, their expressions wary. Daenerys approached them calmly, though Ned sensed the hesitation in her steps. She was young, yes, but there was a composure about her, as though she had endured more than her years would suggest. When she came close, her gaze flicked over Robert, taking in his size and the weight of his presence. Then her eyes moved to Ned, and he felt himself steeled. The sudden tension in the air was palpable. Robert inclined his head, an awkward motion for a king. "Princess," he began, though the word sounded as though it left a bitter taste in his mouth. "We come in peace, to discuss matters that might be of grave importance for both your cause and mine." Daenerys did not speak at once. When she finally did, her voice was soft but sure. "You once waged war against my family," she said, her accent touched by Essos. "Why would you come to me now, King Robert?" The question hovered. Ned saw a flicker of old rage cross Robert's face. Rage at the Targaryen lineage, the heartbreak that had fueled his rebellion, all of it. He saw also the struggle as Robert forced it down. "Because times change," Robert replied, his voice low and resonant. "Because the Iron Throne is mine, and though your father died and your brother fell, I have no thirst for more blood. Not yours, not anyone's, if it can be helped. Rumor reaches me you intend to cross the sea with armies to claim what you see as your birthright. I won't allow that, but I'm willing to talk, to find a way forward that spares us all another war." Daenerys's expression hardened as she clasped her hands before her. "I have no wish to see more blood spilled either," she said quietly. "My life has been shaped by loss, but I have not abandoned the idea that my family's throne is rightfully mine. I don't know that your presence here changes that." The air was taut enough that Ned feared a single wrong word would spark open hostility. He took a step forward and inclined his head politely, interjecting in that calm, deliberate manner he had honed from years of balancing duty and honor. "My lady," he said carefully, "I am Eddard Stark of Winterfell, Lord of the North. I fought alongside King Robert, yes, but I've never wished for the world to burn. If there's a chance to spare the realm another war, we must seize that chance. We come to talk of alliances, not demands." She studied him, her lips pressed together in thought. "Lord Stark," she said softly, "I've heard your name whispered, even across the sea. You are said to be an honorable man." Ned inclined his head, unsure whether that rumor would help or hinder them. "I do my best to keep to my vows," he said. Robert cleared his throat. "We've traveled far," he declared, "and we're weary. May we speak more privately?" He eyed the assembled retinue around the hall. Daenerys seemed to weigh the request before giving a slow nod. So the talks began. They retired to a smaller chamber, with only a handful of trusted attendants on each side. Ser Barristan Selmy stood stoically at Robert's back, while Daenerys had her own close confidants. Chief among them a knight called Ser Jorah Mormont, an exile from Westeros of the House Mormont. Ned recognized the sigil of the Bear from the north. The presence of a man from Bear Island at Daenerys' side intrigued him. He wondered if Jorah had come to trust this Targaryen girl more than his old liege. Time passed in a swirl of guarded words. Robert explained how the Seven Kingdoms had faced rebellions, discord, and the creeping threat of chaos. Daenerys listened, her eyes wary, occasionally drifting to Ned, as if she believed he might speak a truer word than her father's usurper. In turn, Daenerys spoke of how she had survived on the charity of Magisters and the might of her Dothraki husband, Khal Drogo. She had lost him. Ned guessed it had something to do with black magic, though the details were murky, and found herself alone but determined. The realm she sought to rule had once killed her entire family, leaving her little reason to trust. Every so often, Daenerys would say something that caused Robert to grit his teeth. She was not shy in pointing out that the Baratheons had seized power. Ned sensed the old Robert might have roared at her, but this Robert, weighed down by the crown, was trying to keep the peace. Ned played mediator, interjecting carefully and acknowledging past wrongs without undermining Robert's authority as king. Hours wore on, with cups of sweet-spiced wine replenished. Voices rose and quieted. They found themselves at an impasse, the same question repeating. How could the Targaryen rightful heir and the Baratheon king peacefully coexist? Ned finally suggested a notion that had flickered in his mind, unasked. Perhaps, if you wish to return to the Seven Kingdoms, you might do so not as a conqueror but as an ally. The words were bold. He felt Robert's glare burn into him, but they also intrigued Daenerys, whose eyes narrowed. "Explain," she said. Ned met Robert's gaze, trying to see if the king would silence him. Robert said nothing, only gave a slight grunt of uncertainty. "Imagine a marriage," Ned said cautiously, ignoring the churning in his gut, "between houses Targaryen and Baratheon. It's not unheard of in older times for alliances to be forged by wedding bloodlines. King Robert has a son, Joffrey." Robert started to speak, but Ned raised a hand to gently forestall him. "Or Princess Myrcella or Prince Tommen." Daenerys Targaryen is unattached now, if I understand. There might be a path to unifying the claims and preventing war altogether. The words tasted strange in his mouth, but he saw Daenerys's expression shift as if she had never considered such a possibility. Or perhaps she had, but without believing it could ever come to pass. Robert was silent for a long moment. Then, in a hard tone, he said, "This was not what I planned when I called you to my side, Ned." Ned inclined his head. "You wanted peace, Your Grace. This might be the surest path to ensuring that we don't tear the realm apart again." A hush descended. Daenerys looked thoughtful, her brow furrowed. "You would tie your son or daughter to the line you overthrew?" she asked. Robert swallowed, and Ned saw the turmoil in his eyes, memories of Rhaegar, of blood, of Lyanna. Yet the king exhaled and said, "If it prevents war, then perhaps I would." But his tone was measured, not a statement of immediate acceptance. Ned took it as a step forward. They parted that night with the possibility lingering in the air. No firm decision was reached, there was too much pain, too much history. But the notion had been planted. Ned retired to the quarters assigned to him, feeling the tension in his shoulders lighten by a fraction. He was uncertain if Daenerys Targaryen could truly be trusted, but at least there was a chance they might forge some path to peace. He prayed to the old gods that they would guide him. Over the next fortnight, negotiations continued in fits and starts, sometimes overshadowed by mutual suspicion. Word spread through Pentos that King Robert was meeting with Daenerys Targaryen, fueling rumors in every corner of the city. Some believed the king had come to kill the dragon princess, others insisted they were forging some unholy alliance. Ned took daily walks through the manse's gardens to clear his head. The air was thick with the scents of lemon and jasmine, and he tried to find clarity among the swirling complexities. He dined occasionally with Daenerys and Robert, striving to keep them from rehashing old grievances. Sometimes Ser Jorah joined and spoke in Daenerys's defense, explaining how she had endured forced exile, how she had grown from a frightened girl into a formidable leader. Although Ned held reservations, he had to admit she carried herself with dignity. She seemed neither cruel nor insane, a far cry from her father's reputation. Quietly, they established the skeleton of an agreement. Daenerys would formally renounce any intention to raise an army against King Robert in exchange for recognition of her as a royal princess of the realm. The notion of her returning to King's Landing came up, but Robert balked at the idea, still uneasy at the thought of a Targaryen stepping inside the Red Keep. Another possibility was that she might travel to Dragonstone, the ancient seat of House Targaryen. But that too carried complications. For Ned, it was enough to see that some measure of dialogue was happening at all. Step by step, they moved toward a precarious alliance. But the realm was vast, and decisions made in Pentos could swiftly unravel once they crossed the sea again. He tried not to think about what Cersei Lannister would say of all this, or how the lords of Westeros, many of whom had fought valiantly against the Targaryens, would react to a renewed Targaryen presence. At times, in the evenings, Ned found himself in Daenerys's presence without Robert there, and he saw the vulnerability behind her regal facade. She would ask him questions about the North, about the old ways, about his children. "I've never known my homeland," she confessed one night, standing by a carved marble railing overlooking a dark garden courtyard lit by lanterns. "I was born in Dragonstone, but we fled before I can remember. Sometimes I dream of that place, a storm-lashed castle, the roar of the sea. But it's just a dream." She glanced at Ned as if uncertain whether to reveal such personal thoughts. "It might be the will of the gods that I never see it again." Ned was gentle with her. "My lady, if there is a place for you in the realm, perhaps you'll see it sooner than you think. The decisions we make here will shape the future. If it's truly peace you seek, then we must find a way to honor that wish." He noted a flicker of relief in her eyes, that someone believed her desire for peace was genuine. Ned thought of how young she was and how she had been tossed into the storms of politics from birth. He could not quite bring himself to hate her, Targaryen or not. The next day, Robert announced they would sail for a time-out on the coast to Braavos, leaving Daenerys to consider her options. "We must let the girl think over the marriage proposition, if that's truly a possibility," he told Ned gruffly. "She might come around, or she might refuse us. The realm can't hold its breath forever." Ned saw that Robert was impatient, the old restlessness returning, dealing with the complexities of diplomacy wore on him. "We'll go to Braavos," he declared. "It might give her time to see reason, or to realize that if she wants a place in Westeros, she must bend in some way." So they set off once more, the king's retinue smaller now, with only the most loyal knights. They left some behind to maintain contact with Daenerys. forging a semblance of goodwill. Ned wondered if the girl would truly accept to wed a Baratheon prince. He wondered if Robert would truly allow a Targaryen to walk free under his reign. These thoughts churned as the ship cut through the waves. He took solace in the fact that, for the moment, they had not drawn blood. For the first time since learning Daenerys Targaryen was alive, he felt there might be a path that did not end in war. Braavos was a bustling swirl of canals and mismatched architecture. They lodged in the Sea Lord's palace as official guests, though Robert was more reluctant to engage with the Braavosi than Daenerys. He was there only to bide time and gather intelligence. Ned observed that Robert was growing anxious. He missed Westeros, missed the comfort of being in control, perhaps. Finally, Robert decided they must return to Pentos to either finalize this alliance or walk away. Ned dreaded the conversation, uncertain which outcome was more likely. And so they sailed again, back across the narrow corridor of sea that separated Braavos from Pentos. Upon arrival, they found that Daenerys had taken steps of her own. She had been approached by envoys from other free cities, as well as various exiled lords, each offering a different path to power. Ned could see that she was uncertain, that forging an alliance with Robert might cost her the support of more ardent Targaryen loyalists. But she received them graciously, and Ned found himself admiring the young woman's determination to navigate the labyrinth. "I have done much thinking," she told Robert, her chin lifted with quiet pride. "I do not crave war, but I will not relinquish my lineage. If I am to wed a Baratheon, I must be recognized as a princess with rights to certain lands." Robert's face darkened as he digested the request. The tension in the room rose. Yet Ned stepped forward and urged them to find common ground. They debated for hours, tongues sharpened like swords. At last, Daenerys presented a letter penned in High Valyrian, sealed with her own private signet, an offer of betrothal to Prince Tommen Baratheon, who was the youngest and known to be sweet-natured. "Let the future begin anew," the letter read. She suggested that she would travel to Dragonstone under a formal invitation, then proceed to King's Landing with royal escorts. There, a wedding could be held. In exchange, she would officially pledge her loyalty to Robert as king, though she would retain the Targaryen name. The realm would come to see her not as an invading conqueror, but as a royal in good standing, the wife of a Baratheon prince. Robert stared at the missive for some time. Ned could almost hear the storm raging inside him. The notion that a Targaryen would become part of his family twisted old wounds, but there was a sense of necessity in his eyes. "If I accept this," Robert said, his voice a gravelly hush, "it means I'm welcoming Targaryen blood back into the line. Are you prepared to keep the peace, truly?" He looked hard at Daenerys, as if trying to see any flicker of madness. She returned his gaze boldly. "I am," she said. "I have no desire to see my people butchered or to butcher yours. I only want a life that does not involve endless flight and exile." Ned prayed Robert would choose reason over vengeance. After a moment, the king gave a curt nod, though his eyes betrayed conflict. "Then so be it," he said heavily. "We'll send word to the small council. The realm will likely explode in rumors, but we will see it done." Ned breathed in relief. He offered a silent prayer to the old gods for guiding them this far without bloodshed. The path ahead would be rocky, but a path it was. The days that followed were filled with frantic preparation. Robert sent ravens across the sea, dispatching letters to the Queen in King's Landing, to the lords of the major houses, to the Master of Coin and Master of Laws, and to the High Septon, announcing the betrothal. Ned spent hours drafting letters of his own to Winterfell, explaining the surprising turn of events. He could only imagine the shock on Catelyn's face reading the words, "A Targaryen soon to be joined with House Baratheon." Beyond the personal letters, though, the realm's reaction was uncertain. Lannisters might balk, Tyrells might see opportunity, Martells might relish the sight of Targaryen restoration, or at least partial restoration. The realm was a tapestry of alliances and grudges, and this would shake the weave of it. Daenerys, for her part, made arrangements to accompany Robert back to Westeros. She would bring a small retinue, including Ser Jorah Mormont and a handful of loyal advisors. The bulk of her would-be supporters in Essos remained uncertain about the alliance. Some whispered that she was betraying her birthright by bending to the Baratheon king. Others believed it was cunning, a means of regaining a foothold in Westeros. Ned suspected Daenerys herself might harbor conflicting emotions. If she had truly dreamed of taking the Iron Throne on her own, this arrangement must have felt like a compromise. But from compromise, perhaps peace could bloom. When at last they boarded the ships to sail home, Ned stood beside Robert at the prow, Daenerys just a few paces away, her silver hair blowing in the sea breeze. She wore a cloak that bore a faint resemblance to the Targaryen heraldry, though subdued in color. Robert said little, his mood pensive. Ned glanced at him. "You've made a wise choice, Your Grace," he offered gently. Robert let out a humorless chuckle. "Wise? Maybe. It doesn't make it easier, Ned. This could all blow up in our faces once we set foot in King's Landing. Cersei, she'll be livid, I suspect. And the realm? The realm may never accept it easily." Ned put a hand on his friend's shoulder in a gesture of solidarity. "One step at a time. Let's see it through." It was a calmer voyage than the previous one, though the tension aboard felt thicker than any storm. At times, Daenerys would come on deck at night, gazing at the moonlit sea with a distant longing. Ned found himself reflecting on how all of Westeros might shift under this union. The Targaryen sigil might once again fly over certain towers. The name would not vanish into memory. He thought of his children. Would Sansa or Arya grow up in a world where Targaryens were not enemies? It was an odd, dissonant possibility. They landed at Dragonstone first, that ancient, gloomy fortress set upon an island hammered by constant storms. The black walls and dragon-carved gargoyles gave Daenerys pause, for here she was supposedly born. She stood on the ramparts, letting the wind whip through her cloak, her eyes brimming with emotion. Ned watched her from a discreet distance, seeing how the old seat of her house spoke to her soul. "It's strange," she whispered when she realized Ned was near. "This place is in my blood, and yet I know it only in stories. My brother Viserys told me once that we had to take it back. But now he's gone, and the place is empty, waiting." Ned nodded solemnly. "The history of the Targaryens runs deep here. If the king is willing, perhaps you'll have some measure of authority in this castle." He glanced down at the raging sea below. "But that is for future days, once the realm sees you in a different light." Robert lingered only a short while, impatient to return to the capital. Still, it was clear to everyone that Daenerys felt a strong connection to Dragonstone, and Ned guessed it would factor into the final agreements of her betrothal. Soon enough, they continued their voyage. The crossing to King's Landing brought its own swirl of rumors. For every port they stopped in, people caught glimpses of the Targaryen princess traveling with the Baratheon king. It was the stuff of songs and scandal. By the time they sailed into Blackwater Bay, King's Landing was abuzz with talk. The city came into view on a hazy afternoon, its walls rising high and the Red Keep perched on Aegon's high hill. Daenerys stood at the rail, taking in the sight with wide eyes. "So this is the seat of power in Westeros," she murmured. Ned studied her face, wondering what roiled behind those eyes. If her ancestors had built this city into a symbol of Targaryen might, how did she feel stepping onto these shores with no dragons overhead, no triumphant retinue, merely the uncertain alliance with the man whose house had torn hers down? They disembarked in the presence of a large throng. Gold cloaks lined the docks, trumpets sounded, and the small folk crowded to see the spectacle. Cersei Lannister was present, her face set in a stony mask of politeness, flanked by her siblings Jaime and Tyrion. Joffrey, Myrcella, and Tommen stood at her side. Ned could feel the shock rippling through them at the sight of the silver-haired princess. Joffrey appeared intrigued but slightly off balance. Myrcella, curious and sweet, peeked around her mother's skirt. Tommen blinked in confusion, not understanding the significance of this Targaryen's arrival. Robert dismounted from his horse and greeted his wife with a stiff nod. "We'll speak more privately," he said. "Once we've settled." He gestured at Daenerys. "Your new betrothed is the Prince Tommen, if we honor the arrangement we agreed on." The crowd gasped, and Cersei's eyes flashed, but she composed herself quickly. Ned's heart was heavy with the unspoken drama that would erupt behind closed doors. They rode up through the city to the Red Keep, with Daenerys seated in a carriage to avoid potential unrest from the masses. The small folk lined the streets, some shouting curses, "Dragon spawn!" others gazing in awe. Tension pulsed around them like a living thing. Once they reached the castle, the gates slammed shut, and the real negotiations began anew behind the Red Keep's thick walls. In the throne room, that echoing hall of polished floor and looming iron throne, Robert announced to the gathered courtiers that Daenerys was here by his invitation, an honored guest and future bride to Prince Tommen. The assembled lords and ladies let out a collective murmur. Cersei's face was pale with fury, but she managed a graceful curtsy. Tyrion's eyes flickered with curiosity. taking in the scene with his usual sardonic amusement. Jaime's hand stayed near the hilt of his sword, though Ned sensed it was more out of habit than any immediate threat. Over the following days, the Red Keep buzzed like a hornet's nest. The small council convened repeatedly, with Grand Maester Pycelle droning on about precedents, Littlefinger insinuating possibilities for alliances or new taxes, and Varys delighting in the chaos with his usual mysterious half-smile. Robert's temper flared more than once under the pressure of so many competing interests, but Ned remained at his side, trying to act as a moderating force. Daenerys was assigned a suite of chambers and guarded by knights who were clearly uncertain whether they were protecting her or keeping her prisoner. She spent her time exploring the keep, always escorted, her bearing poised and regal in the face of undercurrents of hostility. One evening, Ned was summoned to a private gathering in Robert's Solar. There he found Robert, Cersei, Daenerys, and Tommen, along with a handful of other key lords. Cersei stood rigid, her green eyes cold. Robert looked weary, as though he had sparred with her for hours. "We're to finalize the betrothal contract," Robert said, forcing a jovial note he clearly didn't feel. Tommen, barely more than a boy, seemed overwhelmed, glancing at Daenerys with both fear and curiosity. The princess inclined her head. "I am prepared to sign," she said quietly. "For my part, I ask only what was promised. Recognition of my lineage, the chance to see that no harm comes to me, and a small retinue to remain in my service." Robert grunted. "Done." Cersei's voice cut through the air like a blade. "And what of her claims to the throne?" she demanded. "Shall she publicly renounce them?" The words stirred a fresh wave of tension. Daenerys lifted her chin. "I have said I acknowledge King Robert's sovereignty. I come not to overthrow him, but to stand beside his house. My loyalty will be sworn once the wedding is completed." She spoke carefully, scanning the faces in the room, especially Cersei's. The queen's lips pressed into a thin line. "It must be more explicit," she insisted. Robert's patience wore thin. "Enough, woman," he growled. "We are forging an alliance here. The realm can't be mired in old blood feuds forever." Ned saw how Daenerys's posture stiffened. She was giving up a great deal in name, if not in heart. Yet if it bought her a place in Westeros, perhaps it was worth the sacrifice. The contract was laid out on parchment, sealed by the king's ring. Daenerys hesitated only a moment before pressing her signet ring to the wax. Tommen, with a trembling hand, added his signature, guided by a maester. It was done. The Targaryen princess was now betrothed to the Baratheon prince. For better or worse, the future of the realm had changed in that instant. The wedding itself was planned for a date some months away, to allow time for the High Septon to travel and for the necessary pageantry to be arranged. Ned wondered if the realm's great lords would flock to King's Landing or boycott such a union. Already, ravens had flown, carrying the news to every corner of Westeros. The North would likely be stunned but would trust Ned's judgment. The Riverlands might take it in stride. The Vale was fractured by Lysa Arryn's seclusion in the Eyrie. Dorne, ever resentful of the Targaryen downfall, might see this as partial vindication. The Stormlands, of course, would follow Robert. The Reach and the Westerlands were the true question marks. The Lannisters wouldn't easily swallow a Targaryen at court, and Marjorie Tyrell was rumored to have been a potential bride for Tommen or Joffrey. This new arrangement might anger the Tyrells. Ned braced himself for the coming storm of politics. Gradually, Daenerys began to move about the Red Keep with more acceptance. She dined with the royal family, though the tension with Cersei was always palpable. She conversed with Tommen, who seemed to warm to her quiet kindness. Ned even caught them once in the garden where Daenerys was showing Tommen a small, carved dragon she carried, telling him a story of the dragons from her ancestry. The boy listened with fascination, no doubt enthralled by the idea. Ned's heart twinged with caution. He hoped any illusions of dragon fire would remain only in story and not in real life. The last thing the realm needed was a reignition of Targaryen might. As the weeks passed, Ned found himself in the uneasy role of both peacekeeper and observer of this fragile arrangement. He wrote frequent letters to Winterfell, uncertain whether he could trust the city's couriers or if the letters might be intercepted. He confided in Catelyn about his misgivings, hoping for her counsel from afar. But the burdens of governance in King's Landing waited for no man's personal qualms. Robert pressed Ned to stay on as hand of the king, at least until the wedding was settled. Reluctantly, Ned agreed, well aware that with the Targaryen matter in the balance, Robert needed him more than ever. One afternoon, while Ned paced the halls, he found Daenerys walking alone, her face drawn. "Are you well, my lady?" he inquired gently. She looked up, a ghost of a smile flickering over her lips. "I'm all right," she said. It is difficult. Everywhere I go, people stare at me as though I'm a creature from a legend. Or they resent me. I've heard the whispers, Stark. Some say I enchant the king, that I'll bring dragonfire down on the city. Others say I should never have been allowed to live. And then there are those who see me as a tragic figure or a trophy. I am weary of it." Ned nodded, his heart twinging with empathy. "It's the way of court," he replied. "Rumors abound, especially when people fear the unknown. You are a Targaryen in the halls that once belonged to your family. Give them time, show them you are not here to burn them or enthrall them. Actions speak louder than words." She considered his words and then said, "Sometimes I wonder if I made a mistake in agreeing to this. But I had little other choice. My supporters wanted me to fight, but my chances were slim against the might of Westeros." Ned sighed. "I won't pretend to have all the answers. I believe this path might spare us more war, and for that I'm grateful." Daenerys nodded, then politely excused herself. Ned watched her go, pondering how fate had placed her at the heart of the realm she had once only heard of in stories. Days turned to weeks, and an air of preparation settled over King's Landing. The royal tailors fussed over wedding garments. The Great September was cleaned and decorated. Courtiers whispered about possible alliances and the future shape of the monarchy. Robert, in turn, began to do what he did best, attempt to drown his uncertainties in wine. More often, Ned found him feasting or indulging, half to quell the anxiety. The king grumbled about everything from the cost of the wedding to the presence of Targaryen loyalists creeping into the city. But with Ned's steady voice and a reluctant sense of responsibility, Robert pressed on. Eventually, the day of the wedding drew near. Nobles from all corners of Westeros arrived in a caravan of banners. The Tyrells made an appearance, gracious and polite but with a guarded tone. The Martells, for the first time in years, set foot in the capital, their own grudges with House Lannister simmering. Even Stannis Baratheon left Dragonstone for the ceremony, his face like chiseled granite when he heard of the new Targaryen alliance. The city swelled with lords, ladies, knights, and more, all eager to witness the union that might reshape their world. On the morning of the wedding, Ned rose early. He felt a swirl of emotions reminiscent of how he'd felt on Robert's coronation day or when he himself was wed to Catelyn. But never had a union seemed so fraught with history. The Great September was resplendent in gold and crystal, the sunlight streaming through stained glass. The High Septon waited at the altar, robed in grand finery. Tommen stood at the front, fidgeting nervously. Cersei hovered near, lips pursed. Robert was there, too, clad in his finest regal attire, though a tenseness betrayed his personal conflict. Then a hush fell as Daenerys entered, flanked by Ser Jorah and a handful of lords. She wore a gown that nodded to Targaryen tradition, silver threads and subtle dragon motifs, yet also bore the Baratheon stag embroidered in gold at the hem, a symbolic melding of houses. Gasps and whispers rippled through the crowd. Some beheld her with admiration, others with lingering resentment. Ned watched with measured reserve as the ceremony unfolded. The High Septon spoke of unity, of a bond that would preserve peace. Tommen placed a ring on Daenerys' finger, his hand shaking. She knelt to receive the Septon's blessing. Then Daenerys rose, turned to face the congregation, and pledged her loyalty to the Crown of the Seven Kingdoms. A hush followed, broken only by the Septon's pronouncement, "What the gods have joined together, let no man put asunder." Applause and murmurs swept the sept, though not everyone clapped enthusiastically. Ned caught sight of certain lords who looked on with disapproval. But for the moment it was done. Daenerys Targaryen was now Princess Daenerys Baratheon, wife to Tommen, a part of the royal family. Outside, great festivities began. Feasts were held for days in King's Landing. Musicians played, jugglers performed, and a grand tourney was organized in honor of the wedding, though it was smaller than some, given the tensions. Daenerys watched from the royal box with Tommen by her side, a tentative smile on her face. Robert, for his part, cheered and bellowed encouragement, letting himself enjoy the spectacle. Cersei maintained a mask of neutrality, though every so often Ned caught a glimpse of anger flaring in her eyes. During the celebration, Ned overheard 1,000 rumors. Some claimed Daenerys might poison the king at the feast, others said Robert was planning to imprison her once the wedding was concluded. Still others insisted that the Targaryen line would eventually overshadow the Baratheons, producing dragonblood heirs. The truth, Ned knew, was far more complex. The seeds of alliance had been planted, but whether they would grow into genuine peace or wither in the scorching sun of old enmities was impossible to say. In the days following the festivities, Robert seemed eager to assert that his rule remained unshakable. He held court sessions where he reaffirmed the loyalty of the lords, accepted gifts from various houses, and declared that Daenerys' presence was testament to the realm's unity. Whether the lords believed him or not was another matter. Nevertheless, the clamor of immediate rebellion died down for the time being. With Daenerys no longer a threatening exiled claimant but an official member of the royal family, many found themselves waiting to see what the future held before making any drastic moves. Daenerys herself settled into life at court with cautious grace. She walked the gardens with Tommen, introduced him to old Valyrian tales, and spent hours in the library studying the history of Westeros. She wrote letters, presumably to Essos, to inform her few loyal supporters of her new status. Some responded with outrage, others with cautious optimism. Ned, seeing her day by day, recognized that she was still lonely, a dragon removed from the land of her birthright, yet never having truly called it home until now. The courtiers treated her with a mix of awe and suspicion, though Tommen's sweet nature seemed to be a balm. The boy was kind-hearted, and Daenerys reciprocated with genuine warmth. Ned wondered if, given time, that friendship might become a stable partnership, an odd pairing, but not impossible. Fate had bound stranger couples. A few weeks after the wedding, Ned stood on a balcony overlooking Blackwater Bay, the wind carrying the tang of salt to him. He found Daenerys there, gazing out at the sea. She turned when she heard his footsteps. "Lord Stark," she greeted quietly. He bowed his head. "Your Grace," he said in return, acknowledging her new title. A faint smile touched her lips. "It's strange to hear that. I always thought, if I were ever called Your Grace, it would be as queen in my own right." She folded her arms around herself as though cold. "And now here I am. Not a queen, but a princess consort married to a Baratheon." Ned approached the stone balustrade. "Life rarely follows the path we expect," he offered. "But this path might bring you many things you would otherwise have lost. And it might save countless lives from war." She nodded slowly. "I hope that's true. I truly do." They stood in companionable silence for a time, watching the waves glimmer in the afternoon sun. Finally, Daenerys spoke again, her voice quiet. "I sometimes feel the weight of my house's history pressing on me. I see the Iron Throne and think of my father, the Mad King, and all that happened before I was even born. People speak of Targaryen madness or greatness as though we are bound to one or the other. I don't want to be defined by madness, nor do I want to let my house's legacy be snuffed out." Ned's gaze drifted to the horizon. "We each carry our family's legacy," he said. "Your father was a cautionary tale, but that doesn't mean you must follow in his footsteps. You have a chance to forge a new legacy. It's not easy. The realm is slow to forget, slower to forgive. But give it time. Act with honor, with empathy. Show them that you are different, and perhaps they will change their minds." Daenerys studied him, perhaps marveling that a Stark, of all people, would speak to a Targaryen in such a manner. Then she gave a small nod of gratitude. "Thank you, Lord Stark. I hope to do just that." Her expression grew thoughtful. "And you, why did you support Robert in all this? Why would you not want me dead after everything my father did?" Ned hesitated before answering. He thought of the horrors of war, of the years that had passed, of Lyanna. "I have seen enough bloodshed to last a lifetime," he said at last. "I want my children to grow up in a realm at peace, not one haunted by endless vendettas. If forging an alliance with a Targaryen helps achieve that, then I must at least try. Robert is my friend, and I serve him, but I also serve the realm. It's bigger than one man, bigger than one house." Daenerys regarded him with a solemnity beyond her years. "We shall see if the realm will accept it," she said softly. "For my part, I will do what I can. Perhaps one day the name Targaryen will not be spoken only in fear." She turned back to the sea. The gulls called overhead, and a warm breeze stirred the folds of her cloak. In the months that followed, the realm gradually adapted, albeit uneasily, to the new reality. Tommen and Daenerys remained mostly in the background of court life, overshadowed by Robert's continued feasts and hunts, and by Joffrey's brash presence. Yet Ned saw glimmers of a gentler era forming. Some lords who had once despised the Targaryen name found themselves impressed by Daenerys' composure and courtesy. Others stayed wary, suspecting that a dragon might awaken in her heart at any slight. Through it all, Ned worked to maintain the fragile balance, reminding Robert of their original goal, preventing war and securing peace. Rumors persisted about dragon's eggs in Daenerys's possession, about potential conspiracies with magisters of Essos, about hidden Targaryen supporters in King's Landing. Some were pure fantasy, others had kernels of truth. Daenerys never confirmed or denied such whispers. Instead, she seemed to focus on learning the intricacies of Westerosi governance. She spoke with Pycelle, with Varys, even with Littlefinger, gleaning knowledge of how the realm was administered. Her thirst for understanding reminded Ned faintly of how a young king or queen might prepare to rule. Yet she was not the heir to the throne, she was, at least by the realm's official stance, merely the consort to the second prince. The tangle of claims and successions would remain complicated should the day come that it mattered. One evening after a small feast in the Red Keep, Ned retreated to the Godwood to pray. The Weirwood Heart Tree, there was no true northern tree, but it was the closest he had to the old gods so far south. He knelt beside the quiet pool, the moonlight silvering his cloak. He thought of how improbable it was that he was here with a Targaryen in the castle, forging an alliance that might reshape the future. The wind rustled the leaves overhead as though the old gods were whispering their own uncertain blessings. He prayed for Winterfell, for Catelyn and their children, that they might remain safe and whole in the days to come. He prayed that Robert, in his raucous way, might do right by the realm. He prayed that this fragile bond with Daenerys would hold and that the tragedies of the past would not be repeated. Above all, he prayed for peace, that the Seven Kingdoms might be spared the horrors of another war. The water rippled softly, reflecting the moon and Ned's solemn face. For the first time in a long while, he felt a cautious flicker of hope. The path was fraught with perils, but they had chosen it, and at least it led away from certain bloodshed if they navigated it carefully. Ned murmured his final words of prayer and rose, turning back toward the keep's lights. The night was quiet, but in that hush he felt the looming presence of the future, uncertain yet not hopeless. In the days and weeks ahead, life in King's Landing found its precarious equilibrium. Daenerys attended court sessions with Tommen, occasionally offering a perspective rooted in her experiences abroad. Some lords grudgingly acknowledged that she brought valuable insights about the free cities and Dothraki customs. The memory of her father's tyranny lingered, though, and she had to tread carefully at every turn. Cersei, predictably, did not warm to her daughter-in-law, but for the most part kept her displeasure within civil bounds. Robert's repeated warnings not to stir discord, combined with the watchful eyes of the court, kept her in check. Robert himself seemed determined to make the most of this new arrangement. He boasted about the wedding to foreign envoys, claiming it was a masterstroke in uniting the realm. Though in private he would still grumble to Ned about old grudges and the suspicious nature of Targaryens. Ned simply reminded him that the purpose was to avoid a war, not to rewrite history overnight. And so they pressed forward. Tensions in the realm did not vanish, houses still vied for advantage, petty disputes flared, and lurking threats like the Greyjoys or the hill tribes of the Vale persisted. But the notion of an immediate Targaryen invasion had faded, replaced by curiosity about the new princess. Time, Ned knew, would tell whether the seeds sown here would bear the fruit of lasting peace or unravel into fresh chaos. For the moment, the land breathed a tenuous sigh of relief. War had been, if not averted, at least postponed. The Stormlord King and the silver-haired dragon princess shared the same castle, forging an alliance that might redefine their family's legacies. And Eddard Stark, for his part, stood in the midst of it all, recalling a simpler time when his only worry was the quiet snows of the north. Now he was a pivot on which a new era could turn, an era that might remember him not just as the Warden of the North, but as the man who bridged two warring houses to spare the realm. Yet he could not shake the feeling that darker omens loomed beyond the walls of King's Landing. The seasons would turn, winter would come, and all their alliances would be tested in the face of the greater storms. For now, however, there was a fleeting calm, delicate as a butterfly's wing. If they were wise, if they were united, if the old gods and the new gods alike were merciful, they might hold onto this peace long enough for it to take root. Ned closed his eyes and breathed in the warm southern air, resolved to do his part, whatever fate might bring. He owed that much to his family, to Robert, to the realm, and even, in some strange way, to the silver-haired girl who had crossed the sea in search of a destiny. If forging alliances was the answer, so be it. He would stand as the realm's shield, as he always had, hoping beyond hope that this time it might be enough. Days began to slip by in a fragile semblance of routine after the wedding, though Eddard Stark felt the constant hum of unease beneath every pleasantry in King's Landing. The capital had always carried tension, its winding streets alive with intrigue and its nobles forever maneuvering for advantage. Now a Targaryen princess dwelled among them, a girl who had once lived under threat of the king's wrath and the realm's scorn. Though she was wed to Prince Tommen Baratheon, sealing the alliance that was meant to bring peace, the old hatreds and suspicions did not vanish overnight. Ned witnessed the wary glances that fell upon her in the Red Keep's corridors, heard the hushed voices calling her dragon spawn in corners of the keep. At the same time, a different faction seemed enchanted by her heritage, whispering that the blood of old Valyria might once again mingle with the blood of kings in Westeros. Ned, newly confirmed as Hand of the King at Robert's insistence, spent his days wading through matters of state, hoping that the pale bud of unity between Baratheon and Targaryen would take root. The wedding itself had been greeted by the realm with mixed reactions. Lords who had fought or lost family in the rebellion against the Mad King still harbored bitterness, but others, especially in Dorne, saw it as a faint justice. The Martells, though reserved, seemed quietly satisfied that a Targaryen had returned in some capacity to the halls of power and that the Lannisters no longer stood so unchallenged. Lord Mace Tyrell had arrived at court only to depart soon after, wearing a polished smile but revealing no clear stance. What alliances might be forged or undone in the wake of this union was something every lord weighed in private. For the moment, King Robert clung to the public face of proud host. There were banquets, smaller than the wedding feast, but still grand enough to display the wealth of the crown. Robert feasted and drank more than ever. Ned watched him, remembering the robust warrior who had once strode into battle with laughter on his lips. This Robert was heavier, more careworn, nursing secret doubts about whether he had done right in letting Daenerys Targaryen into his family. Some nights, after the torches in the Great Hall burned low, Robert would corner Ned and rail about old ghosts, Rhaegar Targaryen on the trident, the screams of the dying, Lyanna in a bed of blood. Then he would temper himself, rubbing tired eyes and muttering, "But it's done now, Ned. If it keeps the realm from war, then so be it. Gods know we have enough troubles as it is." Troubles indeed. As Hand, Ned soon discovered that the crown's debts were staggering. Littlefinger, the master of coin, skillfully juggled ledgers and loans, but gold was ever short. The royal coffers struggled to fund the city's expenses, maintain roads, and pay for the endless frivolities Robert demanded. "Your Grace, perhaps a more modest approach to feasting and tourneys would help," Ned ventured one afternoon in council, only to receive a scowl from the king and a dismissive wave from Littlefinger. "The people must see stability," Robert countered, "and what better way to show them than through the king's generosity?" Ned pressed his lips tight, suspecting that generosity was only one piece of Robert's rationale. The king was also eager to revel and forget his misgivings. Beyond financial strain lay quieter, darker whispers. Varys, soft-footed and mysterious, would appear in Ned's solar unbidden, his hands steepled before him, voice full of murmured warnings. "Spiders hear many things, Lord Stark," he would say. "Some in the city resent our new princess. Others see her as a rallying banner. For now, none openly dare to raise arms, not when the king stands behind her. But if Daenerys Targaryen shows any sign of seeking power beyond her station, well, and Varys would leave the threat unspoken." Ned disliked the man's methods, but he took the warning seriously. The city was a tinderbox, any spark could set it ablaze. Daenerys herself was trying, in her own way, to learn the shape of her new home. She spent hours in the Red Keep's library, speaking with maesters about Westerosi history, or walked through the Keep's gardens, where Prince Tommen followed her with a mixture of awe and childish devotion. Their marriage was brand new, more an alliance of thrones than any true union of hearts. Yet Ned could see that Daenerys treated Tommen with kindness, answering his endless questions about Essos, Dothraki horselords, and the dragons of old Valyria. Occasionally, Tommen would blush and stammer, "I wish I could see a real dragon, though." Daenerys would smile gently, though that smile never reached her eyes. Everyone in the castle had heard the rumors she possessed petrified dragon eggs from her wedding in the Dothraki Sea, though no one had ever glimpsed them except perhaps Ser Jorah Mormont. If those eggs existed, they were locked away safely, relics of a lost era. As the weeks turned to months, Ned began to sense that peace might last, if only for a while. The realm grew accustomed, if not reconciled, to the idea that Daenerys Targaryen was now a Baratheon princess by marriage. She did not seek to push her claims, nor did she openly gather an army. In that, Robert's gamble appeared to be working. Still, Ned felt the old god's whisper at the back of his mind, a warning that fortune could change as swiftly as the northern wind. He kept up his duties, reading reports from the north about signs of roving wildlings, scarce harvests in some areas, and the watchful calm at the wall. If only that calm held. He thought often of his children in Winterfell, longing for a simpler life but bound by duty to remain at the king's side. The first real jolt to the uneasy harmony came from Dorne. Prince Doran Martell wrote to King's Landing requesting that Daenerys Targaryen, now a princess of the realm, travel to Sunspear for talks. We have long memories in Dorne, the letter stated. The ties of House Targaryen and House Martell run deep in history. We should not forget the tragedies that befell my sister Elia and her children. Ned read the letter in the small council, feeling the tension rise as Cersei, present but silent, fixed her stare on the parchment. Robert gave a weary snort. The Martells want to see her up close, measure her worth, no doubt. Well, if they think we'll just send her off to them unsupervised, they're mad. Daenerys was not present at the council, but Ned suspected she would be intrigued by such an invitation. Dorne had a storied history of alliances with the Targaryens, some forged in blood, some in marriage. And the Martells had not forgotten that Elia Martell, Rhaegar Targaryen's wife, had been brutally killed during the sack of King's Landing. Though Robert himself had never given the order, House Lannister bore the guilt in Dornish eyes. Allowing Daenerys to meet with them might further ease tensions. Or it might stoke them. The small council debated the matter heatedly. Pycelle droned on about caution and the need for the princess to remain near the seat of power. Littlefinger teased the possibility of forging trade deals with Dorne if we warmed to their request. Varys, arms folded in voluminous sleeves, offered no direct opinion but let slip that the Martells have many connections in the free cities. A favorable alliance could be, well, quite beneficial. In the end, Robert decided to refuse any immediate journey to Dorne. He declared it too risky. Daenerys was, after all, newly arrived and still untested. If the Martells wish to pay homage to the crown, Robert announced, they can come to King's Landing. They'll be welcomed as any loyal vassal is. Cersei nodded sharply at that, though her green eyes betrayed an inner wariness. The council was dismissed and Ned left to deliver the king's word. He met Daenerys in one of the smaller gardens, not the grand courtyard but a more intimate cloister within the keep's outer walls. Red roses climbed the pale stone. She stood by a trickling fountain, Tommen at her side, while the boy was excitedly recounting the story of some cat that had been stalking the castle corridors. When Ned approached, Tommen turned and bowed. Dee, still a child, uncertain how to greet the hand of the king. Ned smiled gently and gestured that he should continue about his day. Tommen scampered off, leaving Ned and Daenerys in relative privacy. She tilted her head, a single braid trailing over one shoulder. "Lord Stark," she said, "is there news?" The question carried the accent of Essos, though her common tongue had improved noticeably. Ned inclined his head. "A letter from Dorne. Prince Doran Martell requests your presence at Sunspear." He studied her expression as she absorbed this. A flicker of longing crossed her face, as though she recognized an invitation that could open new possibilities. Yet Ned's next words stilled her hope. "King Robert has refused. He deems the journey too fraught with uncertainty, especially so soon after your arrival." Daenerys pressed her lips together, a disappointment shadowing her features. "I see," she said at last. "Then it is not to be." She let out a quiet breath, as though mastering her emotions. "I had hoped to speak with the Martells. My brother Rhaegar was wed to Elia Martell. I know so little of her, or of how they lived before everything fell apart." Ned spoke gently. "You must understand the king's caution. He fears potential plots, or that your presence might encourage older loyalties to surface. The realm is still uneasy." He thought of how the Martells had claimed thirst for vengeance for years. Perhaps they wished to see the last Targaryen in the flesh, to measure whether she might be an ally or a tool to undermine House Lannister. Daenerys nodded slowly. "Yes, I suppose that is true." She glanced to the side. "Yet I am no prisoner, am I, Lord Stark? I have come here willingly, sworn my loyalty. Should I not be free to come and go as I will?" Ned hesitated. "It is not my place to say you cannot travel," he answered carefully. "But the king's word must be respected. You are a member of the royal family now, and your movements have significance for the entire realm. Perhaps with time Robert will relent. Perhaps Prince Doran himself might journey here." She studied his face, searching for any sign of falsehood. Finding none, she exhaled and bowed her head in acknowledgement. In the following weeks, the matter of Dorne simmered but did not boil over. Prince Doran, in a careful display, sent a representative to King's Landing. It was his daughter, Arianne Martell, accompanied by a small retinue of Dornish knights. Their arrival stoked immediate curiosity among the courtiers, as Arianne was known to be fiercely intelligent and strong-willed. Ned observed her from the sidelines as she was ushered into the throne room to pay respects to the king. She wore flowing silks of burnt orange and gold, her hair in thick, dark curls pinned back by a slender coronet. A faint smile curved her lips as she gazed upon the assembled royalty. King Robert in all his bearish might, Queen Cersei with eyes like green ice, Prince Joffrey sneering faintly at her, Myrcella and Tommen standing shyly near. Then her gaze slid to Daenerys Targaryen, who stood at Tommen's side, a swirl of silver hair woven into a braided style fit for the court. That momentary look between the two young women held an entire conversation of unspoken meaning. Arianne knelt as protocol demanded, then rose with feline grace. "Your Grace," she said, smiling at Robert. "My father sends his warm regards and hopes for continued peace between the Iron Throne and Dorne." Her voice carried the soft Dornish accent, a measured politeness that could mask steel. Robert eyed her suspiciously, but his voice was gruff yet cordial. "And how fares the Prince of Dorne?" She answered that he was well in health but burdened by matters of governance. The usual pleasantries. Finally, her gaze swept toward Daenerys. She curtsied again. "My princess," she said, addressing Daenerys with a title that recognized her new station under the Baratheon name. "I come in my father's name to welcome you to Westeros, however belatedly. We Dornish have not forgotten your family's ties to ours." Daenerys returned the courtesy with serene composure. "You honor me," she replied. "Dorne has a special place in Targaryen history. It is my hope that our houses can learn to see beyond old wounds and find common ground for the future." The words had the ring of a carefully practiced courtesy, but Ned believed Daenerys spoke them earnestly. Arianne's eyes flickered as though intrigued by the princess's poise. "Let us speak at length, then," she said with a gracious smile, "when time allows." That night, another banquet was held in the visitors' honor. The Dornish contingent arrived in bright hues, reds, oranges, yellows, transforming the dull courtier's palette with a splash of color. Wine flowed freely, music echoed from high arches, and the hall thrummed with conversation. Robert presided over the head table, flanked by Cersei and Daenerys, with Tommen on Daenerys's other side. Arianne Martell sat next to Prince Joffrey, who looked ill at ease with her self-assured manner. Ned watched carefully, his face calm but his senses alert for any misstep. The illusions of civility in King's Landing were like glass, shining on the surface, fragile at the core. When the feast wound down, Robert stood to signal the end of the evening, and the assembled lords and ladies rose. A faint hush settled. Some expected a speech from the king. Instead, Robert only offered a curt nod and a toast to Dorne's presence, then lumbered away with Ser Barristan and Selmy following. Cersei lingered long enough to say something polite to Arianne, then turned on her heel to retreat as well. Tommen had grown tired and was led away by a sleepy-eyed Myrcella, leaving Joffrey alone. The older prince took a moment to scrutinize Arianne, then excused himself with a shallow bow and left, offering Daenerys only a distant glance. Daenerys herself seemed uncertain, glancing at Arianne as if to gauge whether an immediate conversation would be welcome. In the end, they exchanged parting words, promising to speak in the days ahead. And so it began. Over the next several afternoons, Arianne Martell made time to stroll through the gardens or linger in the Red Keep's library with Daenerys Targaryen. The court gossips buzzed about these private conversations. Ned sometimes saw them from a distance, Arianne's bright gown trailing over mosaics, Daenerys's silver hair shining in the sunlight, the pair pausing under an archway to speak in hushed voices. Ser Jorah Mormont, ever Daenerys's shadow, looked on with a watchful gaze. Now and then Tommen might join them, though he soon left if the conversation turned serious. Ned wondered what precisely they discussed. He suspected that Arianne was feeling out Daenerys's true aims and dispositions, and that Daenerys might be equally curious about Dorne's stance toward the Iron Throne. One day, Daenerys asked Ned if they might have a private word. He obliged, finding her in a secluded corner of Maegor's Holdfast, near a gallery where ancient statues of Targaryen kings stood in silent rows. She had been gazing at the depiction of Aegon the Conqueror, carved in dark stone, his posture regal, a dragon coiled at his feet. Daenerys turned when Ned approached. "Lord Stark," she began, her voice low. "You are the king's hand, and I respect your counsel. I wanted to tell you that Arianne Martell has approached me with suggestions." Ned inclined his head, keeping his tone neutral. "I suspected as much. What does the Lady Arianne propose?" Daenerys clasped her hands before her. "She speaks of how Dorne has never forgiven House Lannister for what was done to Princess Elia and her children. Though she does not openly threaten, I can sense the anger that simmers still among her kin. She implies that if I were to seek a greater role in the governance of the realm, or if I desired to reclaim Targaryen influence, Dorne might stand with me. She looked uneasy. I have told her I am loyal to my husband, to King Robert, and that I have no intention of plunging the realm into war. Yet she persists. Ned took a moment to let out a measured breath. Yes, he said quietly. The Martells are proud and patient. They do nothing quickly. If Arianne is nudging you, it suggests Prince Doran is weighing possibilities. They might harbor fantasies of restoring a Targaryen monarchy or at least undermining Lannister power. But you have done right to insist on peace. For now, that is our best hope. He studied her face, finding it clouded. But do you want more? He asked gently. Do you crave a seat on the Iron Throne? Her eyes flicked to the statue of Aegon. Sometimes I wonder, she said in a hushed tone. My father was the Mad King, yes. But my house once united the realm under Dragonfire. We were meant to protect it. And I see how Robert rules. He drinks and hunts and avoids the intricacies of state. Part of me wonders if I could do better if I were queen in truth. She swallowed as if the confession weighed heavily on her. But then I think of the bloodshed that would cause, the heartbreak, the betrayal of the vow I gave. I don't want to stoke more violence, Lord Stark. I am tired of running, tired of seeing people suffer. And Tommen is gentle, so young. I would not do him any harm. Ned felt relief at her words, though caution still pricked him. You are wise to recognize the cost, he said. Peace is never perfect, but for the moment it spares thousands from death. Cling to that, princess. If you rule in any capacity, let it be with compassion. Prove yourself worthy, and perhaps one day the realm will see you as more than the daughter of Ares. She nodded solemnly, a strand of silver hair slipping loose from her braid. Thank you, Lord Stark. I value your advice. In the days that followed, Daenerys remained courteous with Arianne Martell but did not commit to any of her subtle suggestions. Arianne, for her part, seemed intrigued by the princess's resolve. The young Dornish woman spent some time talking with Tommen as well, testing his innocence, perhaps, or gleaning a sense of how his mind worked. She also tried to speak with Robert on behalf of Dorne, but the king proved uninterested. Dorne's had too many grudges for too long, he grumbled. I won't indulge them further. And so, after a few weeks, Arianne prepared to depart, bearing the results of her observations back to Sunspear. Before leaving, she requested a private audience with Daenerys, which was granted in the presence of Ned and Ser Jorah. They met in a small solar with tall windows open to the scorching summer sun. Arianne studied Daenerys for a moment, then said, My father will be eager to hear of your contentment, princess. I will tell him that you are well, that you wish for peace and stability. He may find it comforting, or he may find it disappointing if he hoped for a more fiery vengeance. Her lips curved in a wry smile. But I admire your choice. Perhaps we'll see one another again. Daenerys dipped her head in graceful acknowledgement. I hope so, she said. If you or your father wish to visit again, you'll be most welcome. Arianne's dark eyes flicked to Ned and Jorah, then back to Daenerys, as though pondering whether to speak more candidly. At last, she gave a half-shrug. Dorne may stand apart from the rest of Westeros in many ways, but we are still part of this realm. If we are all to live under one crown, it is my hope that we can do so without repeating the cruelties of the past. Farewell, princess. With that, she departed, leaving behind an undercurrent of unresolved tension. The Martells' visit had been a test. Daenerys had neither spurned them nor embraced their subversive impulses. Ned counted that as a success of sorts. But he wondered if that was only the first of many challenges that would come from all corners of the realm. Now that a Targaryen lived in the Red Keep, every house with a grudge or ambition might see opportunity. As summer stretched on, the capital baked under a merciless sun, and tempers often ran high. The cities sweltered in their hovels, and rumors multiplied like flies. Some claimed Daenerys was with child, forging a new line of dragon-blooded Baratheons. Others said she cast secret spells at night, seeking to hatch dragon eggs in the bowels of the castle. Ned dismissed most of these tales as idle fancy, though he did discreetly inquire with Ser Jorah if the princess was indeed expecting. The knight answered curtly that she was not, and Ned left the matter at that. The real problems lay elsewhere. The Iron Islands, restless under Lord Balon Greyjoy, had begun raiding smaller coastal villages with renewed boldness. Messages from the north spoke of wildling incursions beyond the wall, though the Watch had not issued a call for aid yet. Most pressing was the Crown's crumbling finances. Littlefinger spun webs of gold debts, juggling loans from the Iron Bank of Bravos and wealthy Tyroshi merchants, but the burden only increased. Ned sought ways to cut expenditures, but Robert's appetite for lavish entertainments was hard to curb. The king brushed aside caution, often saying, with the Targaryen threat defused, we can afford to live a little. Besides, I am a king, am I not? Ned stifled his frustration. Perhaps forging peace with Daenerys had lulled Robert into complacency about other looming threats. Cersei Lannister's demeanor toward Daenerys remained polite but cold. She had not hidden her fury when Robert brokered the marriage to Tommen. Now she exercised all her cunning to undermine the princess's standing quietly, remarking in sly ways that Daenerys lacked proper Westerosi refinement or that her Dothraki background made her unsuited to certain courtly traditions. Occasionally, Ned observed Daenerys quietly bristle at these slights but maintain her composure for Tommen's sake. The boy had grown fond of his wife in a shy, childlike manner. More than once, Ned heard Tommen praise her kindness or repeat some anecdote Daenerys had shared about Essos. That budding affection was perhaps the main bulwark protecting Daenerys from overt hostility. Harming her now would devastate Tommen, and Robert, for all his flaws, would not stand by and watch his gentle son wounded. One morning, as Ned went about his duties, a messenger from the Vale arrived bearing urgent news. Lisa Arryn, who had fled to the Eyrie after Jon Arryn's death, had refused to attend the wedding or pay homage in person, citing her son's delicate health. Now she sent word that the Vale was closing its gates to any royal men, for she feared dark conspiracies from King's Landing. Ned read the parchment in disbelief. His sister by marriage seemed to be slipping deeper into paranoia, convinced that the capital was a nest of vipers waiting to devour her and her child. Robert raged upon hearing the news, cursing Lisa's name and lamenting that Jon Arryn's legacy had fallen to a timid woman who saw shadows in every corner. Yet with the Vale so remote and well-fortified, there was little Robert could do but dispatch envoys to try and reason with her. Another crack in the realm's fragile unity, Ned thought grimly. Still, day by day, life churned on in King's Landing. Joffrey resumed his usual aloof displays, strutting in the courtyards with the Hound at his back, sparring with wooden swords or mocking those he deemed beneath him. Myrcella attended lessons, giggling with her handmaids and showing more courtesy than her older brother. Tommen spent time with Daenerys, forging a sort of friendship that might one day become a true partnership. The small council wrestled with debts and diplomacy. And Daenerys herself continued to navigate court life, dining in the Great Hall, making polite conversation with lords who had once sworn to destroy her family, always with Ser Jorah at her side. Ned noticed how Ser Jorah, though outwardly loyal to Daenerys, seemed restless. There were times the exiled knight would vanish into the city for hours, returning with no explanation. Ned's initial impulse was to suspect foul play, but then he recalled Varys's earlier hints that Ser Jorah had once spied on Daenerys for King Robert. Perhaps the man kept up certain contacts. Ned could not be sure. In any case, Daenerys trusted Jorah implicitly, seeing in him a protector who had stood by her through her time among the Dothraki. Ned could only hope that trust was not misplaced. It was on a stifling afternoon, the sun glaring white in a cloudless sky, that Ned received word from the north, another raven from Maester Luwin in Winterfell. The letter was brief but troubling: more wildling activity, a few rangers of the Night's Watch gone missing, rumors of something uncanny in the haunted forests. A chill ran through Ned as he read. He remembered old stories old Nan used to tell of the White Walkers, the Long Night. Yet, in the centuries since, no living man had truly seen such monsters. He told himself that fear of the others was just a fireside tale, that the real threat came from wildlings. Still, he could not shake the uneasy feeling in his gut. Winter was coming, though the realm basked in the tail end of a long summer. He brought the letter to Robert in the council chamber, explaining the need to keep watchful eyes on the wall. Robert snorted. Wildlings always stirring. Tell the watch to handle it. That's their purpose. Ned pressed, they lack men. Their numbers have dwindled over the years. If the wildlings unite behind a strong leader, we could be facing a large-scale incursion. Robert waved a dismissive hand. Then we'll send them some token. Let it be your concern, Ned. I have enough on my plate. But I won't muster half the realm to fight a bunch of half-naked savages. Ned clenched his jaw but nodded, recognizing the futility of pressing further. War with the wildlings might be unlikely, but ignoring the signals from the north entirely was folly. He decided to write back to Maester Luwin, telling him to offer the watch any feasible support from Winterfell's stores and to keep him informed. Not long after, the city stirred with excitement. King Robert, bored with the summer lull, declared there would be a grand hunt in the Kingswood. Ned sighed, recalling all too well the hunts that Robert relished: weeks in the forest, casks of wine, huntsmen, hounds, and the king often returning in a drunken haze. But he had no choice, the Kingswood was law. Preparations began in earnest, with huntsmen scouring the forest in advance for signs of boar or stag. Robert demanded that many lords accompany him, including Ned and Ser Barristan. Cersei demurred, citing pressing matters in the city. Joffrey intended to go, puffing himself up in borrowed armor. Tommen, to Ned's mild surprise, was also invited, though Daenerys quietly insisted that the boy was too young for such an excursion. Robert overruled her. "Nonsense," he boomed. "He's a prince of the realm, let him see how men do sport." Daenerys held her tongue, but Ned could see her worry. She pulled him aside the day before the party was to ride out. "Tommen's never hunted anything more dangerous than a stray cat," she said, voice tight. "He's barely seen a sword drawn in earnest. Is it truly safe for him?" Ned placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, mindful of the watchers that might gossip if they saw too much familiarity. "We'll keep him safe," he promised. "Ser Barristan and I will be there." The hunts in the Kingswood rarely turned dangerous as long as men remained cautious. Her expression stayed anxious. "I wish I could go with him," she said. But Robert forbade it, said the Kingswood is no place for a princess untrained in the bow. "I don't like the idea of Tommen out there alone with the others." She did not name Joffrey, but Ned understood. Joffrey had a way of tormenting his younger siblings, especially if it made him look braver by comparison. Ned gave a small nod. "I'll keep an eye on Tommen." A flicker of relief softened her features. "Thank you, Lord Stark." The hunting party departed at dawn the next day, draped in the Baratheon colors of gold and black, with a handful of other noble banners along for the ride. Ned rode near the front, flanked by Robert and Ser Barristan. Joffrey pranced on a fine courser, posture stiff with self-importance, while Tommen rode a gentler palfrey, eyes wide with excitement at the pageantry of it all. The forest loomed ahead, thick and green. The morning heat already pressed down, promising a long, sweltering day. Robert led them deeper into the Kingswood, bellowing for the hounds to be released. They scoured the undergrowth for boar tracks. It wasn't long before the hounds bayed, leading the men on a lively chase. Robert spurred his horse, cackling with the thrill of sport, while the others followed in a cloud of dust. Ned tried to stay near Tommen, calling out pointers when they crossed tricky terrain. The boy managed well enough, though sweat beaded on his brow. Joffrey galloped ahead, eager to prove himself, ignoring Tommen's struggles to keep pace. Eventually, they cornered a boar in a brambled hollow. The hound snarled, keeping it at bay while Robert dismounted, hefting his spear with a grin. Ser Barristan tried to warn, "Your Grace, best we surround it carefully." But Robert, half lost in old warrior pride, charged in to spear the beast. The boar let out a furious squeal, thrashing. Robert's spear struck home, but not before the boar's tusk slashed at his thigh. With a roar of pain, Robert pulled back, the boar collapsing into bloody dust. Men rushed forward, and Robert cursed, leaning on his spear. "Bah, it's nothing," he growled, though blood seeped through his breeches. Joffrey looked on in wide-eyed fascination, while Tommen let out a stifled gasp at the sight. Ned slid off his horse. "Your Grace, let us tend to that wound." Robert waved him off, but Barristan insisted. "A boar's tusk can tear flesh badly. We must staunch the bleeding." Grumbling, Robert allowed them to wrap his leg in a makeshift bandage. The cut was deep, though not life-threatening if treated properly. "We'll head back," Ned declared firmly, ignoring Robert's protest. The king eventually relented, cursing the accursed pig, but still proud he'd struck it down. Tommen looked shaken. Ned placed a comforting hand on the boy's shoulder. "Your father will be fine," he said, though he silently cursed Robert's recklessness. They rode slowly back to the city, the king wincing whenever the horse jostled his leg. Upon returning, Grand Maester Pycelle fussed over Robert's injury, applying poultices and bandages. By evening, Robert was abed, half drunk on pain-killing milk of the poppy, but in good spirits, boasting that the boar had been the biggest, meanest beast in the Kingswood. Tommen described the event to Daenerys in wide-eyed excitement, though he emphasized the danger, making Daenerys's face pale. She scolded him softly for riding so close, then hugged him, relieved that he was unhurt. However, Robert's wound soon proved more serious than it first appeared. Infection set in, the flesh around the tusk gash turning inflamed and hot despite Pycelle's ointments. Within days, the king was feverish, tossing in sweaty sheets, cursing and groaning. The entire Red Keep seemed to hold its breath. Ned recalled the fear that had surrounded Jon Arryn's final illness. Was Robert's life in danger? If the king died, the line of succession would pass to Joffrey first. And if that happened, Daenerys Targaryen's place in the realm became even more precarious. For nights on end, Pycelle and the royal healers labored to bring Robert's fever down. Joffrey roamed the halls anxiously, feigning confidence, while Cersei stood vigil by Robert's bedside, her expression unreadable. Ned suspected a swirl of conflicting emotions in her, for she had never truly loved Robert, but his power ensured her children's security. Daenerys was not permitted to see the king. Cersei forbade it, claiming the sickroom must be kept free of unnecessary visitors. Ned, however, was allowed to enter once or twice as hand, and he was alarmed by how pale and delirious Robert appeared. On the fourth night of Robert's fever, Ned received a summons to the king's chambers in the dark hours before dawn. He hurried through lamplit corridors, heart-pounding. Was Robert dead? When he arrived, he found Cersei standing near the bed, arms folded, while Pycelle hovered like a fretful crow. Robert's face glistened with sweat, his breath ragged. But when Ned leaned in to check him, the king's eyes opened, watery and bloodshot. "Ned," he rasped, "where is Tommen?" Ned swallowed. "He's sleeping, your grace. He's well." Robert grunted, then coughed wetly. "Good. I need him to be strong." The boy, so gentle. He drifted into a half-delirium, muttering curses at the boar. Ned turned to Pycelle. "Has there been any improvement?" The Grand Maester shook his head gravely. "The infection spreads. I've tried everything, poultices, potions, leeching. He grows weaker." Cersei's knuckles were white where they gripped the bedpost. "He will live," she said, as though commanding it to be so. But there was no certainty in her tone. Ned felt a cold dread. If Robert died, the realm would be thrown into upheaval. Joffrey would be crowned, but his temperament was ill-suited to rule. And what of Daenerys, now tied to this family? Targaryen conspiracies might blossom anew, or Lannister suspicion might see her cast aside. He stayed in the sickroom until sunrise, but Robert's condition did not improve. Cersei eventually withdrew, leaving Ned alone with the king and Pycelle. Around dawn, Robert stirred from a fitful sleep. His eyes focused on Ned for a moment. He beckoned him closer. "Ned, you've always been the honorable one," he mumbled, his voice cracked and weak. Ned knelt beside the bed, memories of their youth flashing, the rebellion side by side in battle, the boyish grin on Robert's face, the heartbreak after Lyanna's loss. "I'm here," Ned said softly, heart aching. Robert's hand found Ned's and squeezed with surprising strength. "If I die," he murmured, breath shallow, "look after them. The realm, my children, even the Targaryen girl. I did this to keep us from war. Don't let it all fall to pieces." He broke into a coughing fit, and Pycelle rushed forward with a damp cloth for his brow. When the fit passed, Robert managed a faint, bitter laugh. "I thought the boar was a grand way to show I was still a warrior," he whispered. "Stupid." Ned pressed his friend's hand gently. "Don't speak like that. You'll recover. We'll see the next tourney, you and I sharing a skin of wine. You'll tease me about my gloom, and I'll roll my eyes as I always do." Robert only gave a faint grunt, drifting away again. Ned stood, and Pycelle dabbed at the king's brow, a worried frown etched on his lined face. The castle sank into a nervous vigil over the following days. Some lords quietly began to court Joffrey, presuming he would ascend the throne if Robert died. Others hedged their bets, uncertain if the king might yet recover. Cersei moved about the castle like a prowling cat, forbidding Daenerys from entering Robert's chambers and ensuring that no one whispered of changing the succession. The Tyrells, the Redwynes, the Royces, and other houses sent anxious inquiries or arrived in the city to watch events unfold. The question was everywhere: would Robert Baratheon, the usurper who had toppled the Targaryen dynasty, die in bed of an infected wound? And if so, what then? Despite the king's prolonged fever, fate did not claim him. Slowly, painfully, Robert began to show signs of improvement. Pycelle's potions began to take hold, or perhaps Robert's formidable constitution fought off the infection. After a full fortnight of fever and delirium, the heat in his wounds subsided and his mind cleared. On the 15th morning, Ned entered to find the king awake, propped on pillows, groggy but lucid. A tray of broth sat on the bedside table, half consumed. Pycelle beamed with relief, proclaiming that the crisis had passed. Robert looked haggard, more so than Ned had ever seen. He had lost weight, his hair matted with sweat, but he managed a crooked grin. "So," he croaked, "the old boar didn't kill me after all." Ned allowed himself a small smile of gratitude. "No," he said gently. You're a tough man to kill, your grace. Robert sank back into the pillows. The realm must be in chaos by now. Ned hesitated. It's uneasy, but stable. We've kept things under control. Robert closed his eyes a moment, then opened them with a determined flash. Summon the council. I want to see them. I won't have them whispering about Joffrey wearing my crown while I still draw breath. By midday, a formal session of the small council was convened in Robert's solar, so as not to move the king too far. He sat in a large chair draped with blankets, looking half a specter of his former self, but he insisted on wearing his crown for the appearance of strength. Cersei stood behind him, pale but composed. Joffrey and Myrcella were absent. Tommen came, accompanied by Daenerys, who lingered quietly in the background, her silver hair bound in a modest braid. Littlefinger, Pycelle, Varys, and Ned took their seats, with Ser Barristan standing to one side. Now, Robert growled, surveying them, I am still king, let there be no doubt about that. I will not die from a damned pig's tusk. He shot a glare at Pycelle, as if daring the Grand Maester to contradict him. Pycelle simply bowed his head in agreement. While I was Abed, were there any great crises that need my attention? His gaze swept the room. Ned cleared his throat, launching into a measured summary. The Vale remained closed off, Lisa Arryn refusing to come south. The Iron Islands had been raiding again, though no full rebellion had erupted. Dorne was quiet after Aerion Martell's departure, though there was speculation about their next moves. And the city itself? Robert asked. Littlefinger smirked. Calmer than one might expect, your grace. The people prayed for your recovery, no doubt hoping for a return of your generosity. The gold cloaks have kept order. Robert nodded, then coughed. His voice was hoarse. Good. That's enough for now. I'll need time to regain my strength. But let it be known. Any talk of crowning my heir while I yet live is treason. He glared pointedly, though no one seemed foolish enough to protest. Now leave me, except you, Ned. He turned to Daenerys. And you stay as well, girl. Ned saw Daenerys' spine stiffen a little at being called girl, but she said nothing. Cersei stepped forward as though to protest, but Robert waved her away. I'll be fine, woman. I need to speak with my hand and my son's wife. Cersei left, her jaw tight, and the others filed out, offering bows. When the door shut, Robert let out a weary sigh. Gods! I feel like my head is stuffed with wool. He massaged his temples. Ned stood by the table, hands clasped behind his back, while Daenerys remained near Tommen. The boy looked uncertain, glancing from Ned to his father to his wife. Robert cleared his throat. Tommen, go wait outside a moment. Guard the door like a good lad. Tommen opened his mouth as if to question, then nodded and slipped out. That left only the king, Ned, and Daenerys in the room. Robert studied Daenerys, his gaze heavy. I see you're still here, he said, voice devoid of humor. I suppose that means you haven't tried to usurp my throne while I was half dead. Daenerys met his eyes steadily. I pledged my loyalty, your grace. I meant it. Robert's mouth twitched. Yes, so you say. And I was the fool who thought maybe forging this alliance would save us from endless war. I still think maybe it was the right choice. But old grudges die hard, girl, especially in my family. You've done well to keep out of trouble while I was laid up. Ned stepped in, his tone calm. Your grace, if I might say, Daenerys has been nothing but dutiful. The city has not stirred toward rebellion. Indeed, your people prayed for your recovery. This marriage stands. And from what I've seen, Tommen trusts her. Robert let out a slow breath, as if weighed by 1,000 regrets. Fine, all of that. But tell me this, Targaryen. Do you hunger for more? He stared at Daenerys with something close to curiosity. My seat on the Iron Throne, perhaps? Or a realm that worships your ancestors? She squared her shoulders. I hunger for a realm that is at peace, without more children dying in a war of succession. I do not deny my heritage, but I have sworn to stand by my husband. If you wish me to sign any oath more binding than I already have, I will do so. Robert blinked, perhaps not expecting so direct an answer. He looked to Ned. She sounds more earnest than half the lords in this city. Ned inclined his head. That has been my observation, Your Grace. Robert's thick fingers drummed on the chair arm. Well, that's good enough for me for now. We'll see how the realm reacts once I'm back on my feet. But let it be known, I don't want to hear a single whisper about Targaryen restoration. Understood. Daenerys bowed her head respectfully. Of course, Your Grace. Robert turned his attention to Ned. And you, old friend, you saved the realm from chaos by keeping matters steady while I was ill. I owe you yet again. If you see anything amiss, if you sense the Targaryen alliance faltering, you come to me directly. I'll not have a dagger at my back after all this. Ned nodded, though inside he felt a twinge of sadness. Was it always to be this way, the Targaryen name synonymous with betrayal in Robert's mind? Daenerys had given no indication of ill intent. But the memory of the Mad King, of Rhaegar, and of Lyanna's death was carved deeply into Robert's soul. With the king's recovery, life in the Red Keep began to rouse from its uneasy hush. Courtiers resumed their gossip in full force, proclaiming it a miracle that Robert had survived. Robert himself remained confined to bed for weeks as his wound healed, bored and fractious. Daenerys and Tommen visited him at times, often with Ned or Ser Barristan in attendance, presenting small tokens or reading stories to pass the long hours. Robert softened slightly, perhaps seeing how genuine Tommen's fondness for Daenerys was. Yet the tension with Cersei never eased. Ned saw the queen glowering whenever Daenerys stepped foot in Robert's chambers, as though she expected the princess to conjure dragonfire to consume them all. Soon enough, though, Robert's health returned in part and he insisted on holding court again. With that came the usual parade of grievances, lords petitioning for lands, merchants complaining of taxes, petty spats among knights. Daenerys observed from the sidelines, gleaning more insight into how Westeros functioned. She spoke softly with Tommen, explaining which great house held which territory or what the role of a master-at-arms entailed. Sometimes Tommen would brighten, asking questions, and Daenerys answered with a quiet patience. It struck Ned that, in another life, Daenerys might have grown up in the Red Keep from birth, a princess of House Targaryen. Now she was forging a place here under different circumstances, but forging it nonetheless. Away from the throne room, the city itself was stirring with new rumors. Some claimed that House Greyjoy was preparing for open rebellion again, tales of Theon Greyjoy, Ward of the Starks in Winterfell, possibly returning home. Others whispered that Tywin Lannister was mustering men in the Westerlands, displeased by the new dynamic in the capital. The tension with the Vale remained unsolved. The Iron Bank of Bravos pressed the crown for repayment of massive loans. Ned found himself half-buried in parchment daily, trying to keep the realm from fracturing. At least the arrangement with Daenerys kept the threat of Targaryen invasion at bay, for she was here, in the heart of King's Landing, openly allied with the crown. As the days turned cooler, a hint of autumn brushed the air. The small folk went about harvesting what they could, uncertain if the end of the long summer was near. Grand Maester Pycelle, in his pompous way, predicted that the season might stretch another year, but others, including Ned, suspected the pattern of the winds indicated a change. If winter came soon, the realm's troubles would magnify, especially in the north. Ned wrote to Catelyn often, imploring her to store surplus grain. He yearned to ride home, but Robert's insistence that he remain as hand kept him firmly in the capital. One late afternoon, after the final petitioners had left the throne room, Ned walked Daenerys back toward her chambers at her request. Tommen had gone off to his lessons, and she was momentarily without her usual retinue. Ser Jorah was away on some errand. The corridors were hushed, lit by shafts of golden light from high windows. Daenerys looked tired, though she carried herself with dignity. "Sometimes I feel like a stranger in my own land," she murmured. "Though the people call me princess, though I wear the trappings of Westerosi court life, I see them look at me as if I were a curiosity from a far-off realm. And truly I am. When I speak, I hear the Essosi lilt in my voice." She paused, a faint sadness in her eyes. "I wonder if they will ever truly accept me." Ned offered her a gentle nod. "Time can mend many divides. The realm may not embrace you immediately, but each day you stand beside Tommen, each day you serve the realm's peace, you prove you're not the dragon they dread." She lowered her gaze. "I appreciate your reassurance. You've been kind, Lord Stark. I won't forget it." Her words were soft, but he sensed the sincerity. A part of him still felt the old caution whenever he looked at her silver hair. The Targaryens had caused so much pain. but Daenerys herself seemed determined to break that cycle. They continued walking, their footsteps echoing on polished floors until they reached the corridor that led to her chambers. 2 royal guards stood watch. She bade Ned farewell, and he bowed slightly. Just before stepping through the door, she turned back, an unspoken question in her eyes. Then she simply nodded and disappeared inside. Ned stood for a moment, ruminating on how much had changed since he and Robert had first set sail to find her. They had come seeking to prevent a war, and in forging this strange union, they had at least succeeded in staying one immediate catastrophe. But the realm remained a tapestry of shifting alliances, and beyond the walls of the capital, shadows lengthened. If winter truly drew near, if the White Walkers were more than a myth, if the Iron Islands rebelled once more, or if Dorne lit the spark of vengeance, so many possibilities for ruin lurked. In the weeks that followed, Ned did his best to bolster the alliances that might keep the peace. He encouraged Daenerys to receive envoys from various regions, letting them see her even-handed courtesy. He suggested Robert reduce some of the more extravagant hunts and feasts, redirecting funds to the City Watch and the Royal Navy, which might deter the Iron Islands. Robert grumbled but yielded in small increments, still not fully recovered from his wound. Joffrey, for his part, strutted more arrogantly than ever, as if Robert's brush with death had made the older prince see his father's throne as tantalizingly near. Fortunately, Joffrey seemed to find Daenerys beneath his notice, more interested in tormenting Tommen or boasting of his lineage than confronting his new sister-in-law. Every so often, Ned would receive a raven from Winterfell with news of his own children. Robb guiding the holdfast in Ned's absence, Sansa practicing her courtesies, Arya running about, restless with needlework, Bran climbing despite repeated warnings. The thought of them warmed Ned's heart, reminding him of what truly mattered. He wrote back faithfully, giving fatherly advice, though he missed them fiercely. He prayed the gods would keep them safe. Late one night, well past the hour of the owl, Ned found himself awake, pacing in his solar, studying reports from the north. The candle at his desk flickered, casting wavering shadows on the walls. He read of more wildlings sighted near the Shadow Tower, of rumors of a self-styled king beyond the wall named Mance Rayder. A chill coiled in Ned's gut. If the wildlings truly rallied under one banner, they might attempt a massive crossing of the wall. The Night's Watch was too diminished to stop a determined host. Ned set the parchments aside, rubbing his temples. Another worry among many. Suddenly, a light rap sounded on the door. Ned opened it to find Daenerys Targaryen standing there, cloak drawn about her slight frame, face pale. Behind her stood Ser Jorah, looking grim and protective. Ned frowned. Princess? Is something amiss? Daenerys glanced down the corridor, ensuring no guards were listening, then slipped inside. Jorah followed, shutting the door. I'm sorry to come so late, Lord Stark, Daenerys said softly. But Ser Jorah received a raven from a contact in Pentos. It concerns news from the Dothraki. Ned's brows rose. The Dothraki? He recalled that Daenerys had once been wed to Khal Drogo, now deceased. She nodded. There's a new call stirring, uniting some of the Khalasars. He claims to be Drogo's cousin or some distant relative. I'm not entirely certain. Rumor says he might attempt to cross the Narrow Sea if he can secure enough ships. Essos is ever-changing, but if this call grows strong, he might look to Westeros as a conquest. Ned exhaled sharply. Another potential threat from across the sea, one the realm could scarcely afford. Do you believe it likely? He asked. She hesitated. The Dothraki fear the sea, calling it the poison water. They seldom set sail, but desperation or ambition can drive men to new lengths. I simply thought you should know as Hand of the King. If a horde of Dothraki ever lands on these shores, the devastation would be enormous. Jorah crossed his arms. They would pillage like nothing we've seen, Lord Stark. The lords of Westeros have faced rebellions and invasions, but the Dothraki fight differently. Burning, looting, enslaving. They'd be unstoppable in open country, though the mountains and castles might blunt their advance. Ned nodded gravely, trying to weigh how real the danger was. I appreciate you bringing this to me, he said. I'll speak to the king, though I suspect he'll dismiss it. Robert has grown weary of foreign threats. Still, we can prepare the Royal Navy, encourage the lords of the Narrow Sea to watch for suspicious ships. Perhaps we can deter any crossing if the Dothraki even attempt it. Daenerys's gaze flicked around the solar. Thank you, she said. I would not see this realm suffer the horrors I witnessed in the Dothraki Sea. They are ruthless to those they conquer. A shadow crossed her features, memories of losing Khal Drogo, of the blood magic that had almost claimed her life. Ned saw the haunted look in her violet eyes and realized anew how much this young woman had endured. She bowed her head. I'll leave you to your rest. Then she turned to go, Yora at her side. At the door, she paused. Lord Stark. I know many might doubt me, but I do care what becomes of Westeros. I have no wish for more bloodshed. Then she slipped out into the dark corridor, cloak trailing behind her. Ned stood alone for a while, letting her words echo. He believed her, at least for now. Her actions thus far had aligned with peace. Whether the realm could avoid the storms gathering, internal, external, and possibly supernatural, was another question. But as Hand of the King, he would do everything in his power to hold it all together. Robert had once commanded him to keep the realm from war and chaos. With a Targaryen in their midst, a Dothraki call rumored to rise, rebellious stirrings in the Iron Islands, the Vale in seclusion, and the White Walkers possibly stirring in the far north, it felt like juggling knives over a pit of flames. And yet, in quieter moments, Ned remembered the vow he had made to Robert on that sickbed, don't let it all fall to pieces. He would try, God's help him. He would try with all his strength. As summer waned further, the small council received a visitor from the Iron Bank of Bravos, pressing for repayment. Robert, newly on his feet and surly, tried to bluster. When that failed, Littlefinger stepped in, weaving a labyrinth of future trade promises and incremental interest payments. The Bravosi envoy left unconvinced but forced to accept a compromise. Meanwhile, the cost of provisioning the city soared. Joffrey demanded a lavish name day celebration. Robert initially refused, then relented under pressure from Cersei. Ned found himself reeling from each new expense. The realm was hemorrhaging gold faster than they could replenish it. Daenerys watched these proceedings from the sidelines. She asked a few questions about finance and taxation, surprising some by her interest. Ser Barristan, hearing of her curiosity, once told Ned, she reminds me, in some ways, of Rhaegar when he was young. Thoughtful, always wanting to understand the people and the realm. Yet she's no fool and she seems kinder than Rhaegar was distant. Ned listened, uncertain how to respond. Rhaegar had been a figure of tragedy, beloved by many, hated by others. But perhaps there was a spark in Daenerys that could shape her into a fairer presence than her father or brother. The crisp wind of early autumn whispered through King's Landing. Leaves turned golden in the surrounding woods. Rumors trickled in from the Westerlands that Tywin Lannister was mustering men, allegedly for a routine exercise. Ned and Robert exchanged uneasy looks, for Tywin did nothing without purpose. Another rumor said Balon Greyjoy had begun building more longships. We'll be pinned between Lannisters and Greyjoys if we're not careful, Robert muttered. Gods, I miss the days when the biggest threat to me was a boar in the forest. All the while, Daenerys Targaryen quietly learned, forging friendships with some minor lords and ladies who appreciated her courtesy or admired her exotic grace. She corresponded with a few of her old acquaintances in Essos, gleaning what she could about the new call. She stayed close to Tommen, encouraging his gentler nature amid an environment that often rewarded cruelty, especially from Joffrey. Now and then, Ned thought he glimpsed a flicker of genuine fondness between the child prince and his silver-haired bride. They were bound together by circumstance, but perhaps that bond could blossom into a real partnership, a new union that might one day anchor the realm when Robert's generation passed. Ned prayed that day would not arrive too soon. The realm was not ready for another transition, not with so many wolves at the door. Yet time marched forward, heedless of mortal fears. Despite all that had been done to secure an alliance before the war could begin, Ned had the constant sense that a storm was gathering just beyond sight. He could feel its winds in the nightly reports, in the tension among the great houses, in the ominous hush that came over the court whenever talk turned to the future. And in his darkest moments, he recalled the old stories of the Long Night, of the White Walkers that once brought the world to the brink of oblivion. If such threats were real, the realm would need unity more than ever. For now, that unity rested on fragile shoulders. Robert's battered strength, Ned's tireless efforts, and the slender figure of a Targaryen princess who had come to Westeros not in conquest, but in compromise. So far, it had sufficed. Ned could only hope and strive, with every bit of honor he had, that it would continue to do so. For the sake of the Seven Kingdoms, for his own children's future, for the countless lives that would be undone by any new war, he prayed that fate would not shatter this delicate peace. Yet the pages of history were spattered with the blood of those who believed they had tamed the dragons only to be burned in the end. Still, as he gazed out one twilight from the Red Keep's ramparts, the city's lights flickering below, Ned Stark allowed himself one quiet moment of hope. Winter was coming, but perhaps, this time, the realm would stand united enough to endure it. And if the dragons did rise again, well, this time they might serve not as instruments of terror, but of harmony. It was a slender hope indeed, but in the face of looming darkness, hope was sometimes all a man had.